Hello, I'm Rubicon Ranger, and welcome back to One Take Triforcing, except it's not One Take Triforcing. Today we're going to talk about something completely different. All of the videos that I've done so far have been about micro, or the details of how you put your bot together after you've chosen the things you're going to use, and trying to make that as efficient as possible. But unfortunately, that's only half the battle. So today we're going to cover macro, which is the selection of your components, how many of them you want, where you want them generally, and generally the shape of your bot and some other overarching choices that you're going to make that affect the performance of your bot far more than details and routing. I've been putting this video off because I believed that it's not as easy for people to digest this information. I really want people to be able to make what they want, and people want to make what they want. And I believe the best way to do that, to get them to the right place, is to just help them along with the videos that I've been putting out already. But there are some things that I feel that are important that we should probably mention about building a robot that people tend to sometimes overlook. So we were going to go over those today. Starting with component selection and a few other things. So, when you start building something, what do you want to use? Well, you want to have guns on it, and you need to be able to move and shoot to play in the game. And how do you decide how many of those you want? So you're going to notice down in the maximum fire rate count in the details of this weapon, you need at least 4 guns in order to sustain maximum fire rate. So when you build a bot and you use a particular gun, check the details and see how many guns you need to have maximum fire rate. It's going to be different for different guns. Generally, single mount guns, you need 4 guns to have maximum fire rate. So you want at least 4 of them on your robot if you want to be able to fire as fast as possible. There is a smart gun update which was put in a while ago, which makes it so that a lot of these weapons will, even if not all of them have angle, you can still have max fire rate on the one that does have angle or can shoot the enemy. But sometimes 4 guns isn't enough, because when you take damage, you lose some of your components. So what you probably want to do is you probably want to have multiple weapons, more than the maximum or the minimum needed for maximum fire rate, and you want to be able to have some of that max fire rate still when you take damage. So at least 2 times the number of guns, or if it's a backup weapon, like if you're just using the tier 0 lasers as a backup weapon, you still want to have at least 1.5 times redundancy, so maybe like 6 guns. But it's nice to be able to still sustain that maximum fire rate even when you've lost some weapons. And this is, once again, a very personal taste thing. This is just to help you understand that there is an extra statistic that you need to pay attention to. So let's talk about a couple other things now. Let's talk about the ideal body shape. So once you've picked out your guns and your movement, which actually I'll quickly go over that. So movement parts, you generally want to have movement redundancy. So this can include mixing parts. Generally, you can look at the optimum carry mass for things like hovers, and it'll give you a good idea of how many you need to carry a certain weight. So you can generally take the weight of your bot, divide it by the optimum carry mass, and that will give you the number of hovers you roughly need to have. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less, up to personal preference. And since they're on the inside, you'll lose hovers roughly at the rate that you'll lose the rest of the mass of your bot, depending on how it's routed. So that's a good rule of thumb. Other things it doesn't apply for right away. Rotors have a very high carry mass for what they are, and you need a little more of them. So for instance, if my bot was 11,000 kilograms, I would probably need more than just one rotor. And since they're on the outside of your bot and they're more likely to get shot off, you probably want even more than that so that you have some left to move around if a couple get taken off early. And we'll talk about ways to help protect these later. But back to ideal body shape. So your ideal robot is actually a sphere. And well, why is that? So if you build a bot out of cubes, the worst thing that can happen to you is when you get cut in half. Getting cut in half separates one half of your bot from the other, and the half, once the components are separated from one another with more CPU, will stay, and the other half will go away, as we've talked about in previous videos. And you can see that in the build bay. And if I take one off of this side, that has less CPU, so that you'll lose that half. But that's usually how people end up dying very early. And a sphere has maximum volume to surface area ratio. And if you cut it, so if I cut down that center plane like we just did, the amount of area that you have to cut through is roughly proportional or higher than, it tracks roughly with the amount of volume that's cut off, and so you have to make a cut through the maximum amount of surface area in order to separate two halves of a certain volume. So even if I cut a smaller half off, like if I cut right here on this third from the outside, only just to remove these couple blocks on the edge, I'm still going to have to cut a massive surface area off in order to remove that volume from the other side of the bot. So why don't people build sphere-shaped bots? Well, unfortunately, you're not always going to take damage from all directions. A sphere would be great if you took damage from all directions, but usually you face the enemy. So what ends up happening is your bot ideally should take more damage from the front if you're always facing the enemy. So, and you can see that in a lot of old designs. So I'll go back to one of the old hovers that I made, and a lot of these are just brick shape, but some of them are even potato shaped. Like this one kind of looks like an elongated sphere. And it's so that the front can take more damage, right? Your bot will still stay, whole. Of course, this gives you a weak dimension, so now your length is weak. So you want to avoid taking damage from the top, sides, and bottom. But there's always a balance, and there's different shapes you can use to achieve resistance against damage from different directions. So the other thing I just talked about, so that's basically, having things up in front to take damage. And as you remember, if you look back at some of the old videos, I talked about how you want components that can take damage up in front, so higher health per CPU components up in front, and lower health per CPU components in back. So this is an old copter from an old builder called Noki, and I think it was one of probably the first kind of metabots that I used, and it has a very interesting design. It's not necessarily relevant now for reasons of micro, but the macro on it is very good, and it performs very well. And let's look at probably why. So he has a lot of thrusters and movement in the back all packed in, and these are legal placements. Pretty cool. Very close packed. Now if we actually check, so let's see, his health effective components are up in front. So he's got a lot of rods and blocks up in front, but how many blocks can get taken off the front before you hit those components in back? Let's actually check. So this is layer 1, and it's kind of on the nose. It's not a full layer, but it's just still something that's there. And then layer 2, and you'll notice that he's got some control thrusters here, and these are for tilt and control if he falls down on the ground and maybe he gets shot in the back a little bit. So, and you'll see that mirrored. So that's layer 2 and 3. So 3 layers, 4 layers. And here we have another set of control thrusters, so more tilt thrusters, and then left and right turning thrusters. And this is meant to be used with camera control and relative tilt, so you face where you're pointing, both by tilting and by turning with your mouse. So I think this was layer 5, 6. And then we have another layer. And now we have some of his backup hovers, and this is the forward-facing set for a little bit more stability. So the hovers were mounted in here. So, and those are actually, the actual mounts themselves are back another layer. And then there's yet another layer. And finally now we start to see some of the movement parts at the back. And you can see when I take off the body, there's 2 rotors attached to the shell, but there's also rotors attached to this piece in the back, and he's got some rods here to make sure that if the back is the only thing that's left, he'll still have some guns attached to those movement parts and whatnot at the back. So we have a very effective, almost like core style build. Now the problem with this is if you get hit from the side or the back, you're going to be losing these components very early. They're mounted right next to one another, so if you get hit in the back, you're going to get hurt pretty badly. But you have more potential with this build than you would one where the movement parts are spread out, because you're more likely to take all that damage from the front if you play correctly and keep the enemies in front of you than you would be with another build where some of those less health efficient components will come off earlier and you'll die earlier. So this is a very put all your eggs in one basket style build, but counting back from the front, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, basically 8 blocks of armor before you start hitting any of the critical movement components. So there's issues with micro on this, like the guns are just block mounted, and this one's got a rod going right to it. But this is a long time ago, so. And you can kind of see this mimicked throughout a lot of designs. And my early hovers kind of had a long pointy shape to take more damage in the middle to prevent me from getting split. So my enemies are in front of me and I keep them in front of me, and the point absorbs more damage so that they can't go through, core me out through the center. But this isn't, this is pretty spherical. But let's talk about some other shapes other than spheres. And here we have a pretty potato-shaped build. I have a Metabot museum, so I'm just going to kind of go through history and look at some of my builds and look at some other builds I've kind of picked up along the way. So this is an interesting one. A144 classified used this bot a lot back during boosts. I believe someone else actually made it. I can't remember who. I think it was originally called the Valkyrie. I'll have to look and maybe put it in the comments later who the original designer of this was. But the idea is it's a very flat bot, you notice. And from the front, it's about 4 blocks thick. And the profile is special because it covers the wings, or the rotors. So if you're getting shot at from the front, your rotors are pretty well protected. And you can even put cosmetics on the end here to try and cover the shape of the bot, the rest of the rotors. And from the front, if you're shooting right in the middle, even if you're trying to core it out, there's still a large mass that prevents the two halves from being separated. And then he's got his guns mounted all around there. And this is my rendition of his bot. This is not his bot. This is my own recreation, and the rods are all attached to, routed to like different points on the shell. So let's skip forward a little bit more. We have more copters that kind of follow the same ideology. In fact, this one is a brick shape, and you get the brick shape because guns need basically a flat space underneath them. So after you shape your bot to cover important movement parts, the guns still require a flat surface underneath them to be mounted. So a lot of the times you end up with a kind of brick look. And this is just the idea of keeping your body in one mass. If you have a weak dimension, so for instance this bot, if it were hit from the top, it would do very poorly. But knowing this as the builder, you would try to compensate for that by keeping the enemies in front of you and to the sides of you. So if someone's shooting from this angle or this angle, you're still very hard to hit. But if they get above you or if they get below you, then you'll be much easier to hit. So this brick is kind of the same concept, but it's just taller. And now you have a box that's basically covering your rotors from the front. And this works perfectly well with the rotors in back. You just have to be conscious of where your hovers are placed. You have to make sure they're a little further back so that it doesn't hinge when it pulls up off the ground, because hovers have different lift speed. But from the front, it's still pretty tanky. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then I think I have a lot of the hovers back here. So same kind of concept, lots of hovers there. I think there's a build from Save the Whales here, which I edited for one of my clanmates at the time. And mech legs combo with rotors for other reasons that I guess I can talk about it really quick. So when you jump with a mech leg, you can turn in the air, but if you only have one rotor, you can't turn in the air. So if you jump off the ground with a mech leg and you still have at least one rotor, you'll be able to jump and turn in the air with just one mech leg. And since mech legs have basically unlimited carry mass, if you have even one mech leg left, it will still carry your whole robot. And the smallest ones can be pretty well encased and also act as rail penetration stoppers. So that's why they were used back in the day, kind of like that. So let's skip forward a little bit. And now we have ones that are hovers that are quite chunky. This was basically a tank bot back in the day. And it has a fairly low profile. So from the sides, it's still kind of thin and long. It's still, you can shoot into the middle and it'll be more easily separated. But it's got a low profile from the ground, basically on the sides and in the front. From the top, it's also slightly harder to hit because it's thin side to side. And then it's got the bit on front. So the weakest dimensions would be right from on top and right from below. So those are the flattest dimensions and the places where it would be worse to have an enemy shoot you from. This is Hashtwas's hot dog hover, or I think Robert actually made this one. And I copied it back during the boost era because I had some qualms with the routing, like the hovers being attached to the same block in the middle. So I attached them back and other ones forward. But once again, this is a very thin bot. It's only 7 blocks thin. So from the front and the top, you have a very thin profile if you can keep an enemy in front of you and lined up with your center plane, right? And it's the same concept with, I believe I have a bot from Mad Max, or a macro from Mad Max here. he built these tall hovers, and I liked them because they worked the same way. They had a thin profile from the top and from the front. Now, of course, you're weak from the side, but you'd just be very careful with how you played in preventing enemies from getting into your flanks. And you can see this with different builds. Mortar needs to be closer to the ground, so you have a flat build, so it's closer to the ground. Um, all these different kind of archetypes follow a similar trend. And even camera drones. So if I go look at a camera drone, let's go find one. Here's a camera drone. So from the front, it's got a very thin, small profile. And so you'd keep enemies in front of you, and then you'd use tilt to make sure that you're always facing them. So all this is just to say you have to be conscious of what you're using. And ideally, let's actually talk about weapons and choices of components. So there's a lot of hybrid components that complement one another. So hovers can be used with rotors, and when you lose your rotors, you'll still have backup hovers. Hovers are probably the best backup movement in the game because they deactivate in the air, and if you do fall through the air, you actually kind of parachute down. So if you put them above your legs will swing underneath you when you fall. There's a lot of good reasons to use hovers as backup movement parts, but they work inside your bot, and they're very small and they can be encased, which is the main reason why they're used, the small ones. So when you're building something, you want to think about how the weapons complement one another, and what you can do for your actual build to complement the use of those weapons. So if I go to any of my modern builds, you try to complement things. So for instance, if I have a build with close quarters weapons on it, so splitters, for instance, I would use a bunch of movement speed because you want to be able to get into range to use those weapons. Same thing with an ion. It's a close range weapon, so you want the ability to get into range. And if you look up builds on the CRF that have ion on them, you'll notice a lot of them had speed boost because if your only effective weapon only works in close quarters, you're going to want parts that allow you to get close to use those weapons. So it's complementary. Same thing with any of the other weapons that go together. So you can pick a high damage per energy weapon, and it won't necessarily combo well with the small nanos, but it used to be small nanos wouldn't use any energy. So you could have very high energy use weapons, and then you could have small nanos to use in between the times you were firing. So same thing with, actually right now, splitters are really energy efficient. So you could have a bot with splitters and nanos, and you could use the splitters, and they have like a 50-second burn. So you could use the splitters for a good period of time and then switch to your nanos and heal a teammate, and then come back to the splitters and still have energy to use them. And modules and everything complement these roles. So if you have a long-range bot that has a sniper weapon on it, and you want to still have another shot when you take some, or when you are low on energy, you can put a weapon energy mod on. So a lot of my bots with rails will have weapon energy mod. If you have a brawling bot that has to fight up close, I'll go back to the splitter, you can have a dish shield module so that you can contest a point with it. So just thinking about ways that you can make your bot complement itself and be more effective in a fight. So that's what this episode is about. I probably won't go too much more in depth unless people have questions. All those relevant questions should probably be addressed in build videos that talk about how best to use all the different movement parts. So I'll probably keep it to those. Anyway, have a good day. Bye.